As we begin unit number 7, we're on the eve of the 20th century, which I guess you figured out from having done the first 6. Some historians have called the 20th century the American century because of the dominance of the United States in terms of world power, cultural influence, all kinds of things, particularly the last half of the 20th century. But in the 1890s, on the eve of this American century, some very interesting things began to happen, and had just happened, that help us understand what comes next pretty well. And to get you thinking about that, let me put 3 words in your notes, and we'll get back to those in a few minutes. These words represent what we might think of as themes, dominant themes in American history from the beginning. So as you think back over the first 6 units, what have been the themes of American history? Well, you might argue that this is the biggest one, the expansion of the United States, the expansion of the American people. Beginning with when we got off the boat at Jamestown, we're moving west. It's an amazing story, and we've talked about it a lot, particularly in the last unit as we finish the conquest of the West. In fact, one historian in 1890 said the frontier is closed. It's done. Most of the places in the West that had been wilderness just 40 or 50 years before were now states, fenced off with barbed wire, tracked across with railroads, steel plows plowing it all up. Hundreds of thousands of Americans and Europeans flooding out into the West. So one could argue that by the 1890s, this theme in American history had kind of come to a stopping place. So put that one in your notes, the expansion. Let me bring you to a second word that certainly is a major theme in American history, and that is the industry that the American people have always displayed. Now, usually when we think of the term industry, we think of factories and smokestacks, and we think of the term in relation to the Industrial Revolution we just talked about in Unit 6. But from the very beginning of American history, people have been very industrious, which means producing lots of stuff, working hard, making a lot of hay while the sun shines. Here you see a bunch of women around the turn of the century working in a typing pool. So the labor, the hard work, the industriousness of the American people, another major theme we have seen as we have progressed through the course to this point. Now, this third theme might not come to you quite so easily as you think about it. Americans have always seen themselves as being on the cutting edge of change. In order to form a more perfect union, we wrote up the Constitution of the United States. Declaration of Independence was a clarion call to the world for government by the consent of the governed. Here you see a painting from the 1890s showing a politician by the name of William Jennings Bryan using religious symbolism to argue for the free coinage of silver, the famous cross of gold speech that he gave. Well, Americans have always seen themselves this way. Now you might say, well, they were pretty slow about reforming some things on their own. For example, getting rid of slavery. Indeed. In fact, it took until the middle of the 19th century and a brutal civil war to decide to reform that institution out of existence. And maybe to this very day, we haven't managed quite to get rid of the legacy of it. But nevertheless, Americans have always seen themselves this way. And by the turn of the 20th century, this notion that Americans were the great reformers of the world, that we were the people who were going to show the world a better way, was a very persistent theme and a very persistent idea that Americans had about themselves. So as you look at these 3 terms, and again, we'll get back to them later, you've kind of got 3 of the most important, let's just call them major themes in American history. Now they're going to come together in an interesting way in this first story we're about to tell. Let me get started on that by showing you a map. I don't know how interested you are in geography, maybe not very, but you can certainly recognize this region of the world, the Caribbean. Here you see the northern part of South America, Central America. Here's the southern part of the United States, the Florida Peninsula. And then the islands of the Caribbean. Here you have the island of Cuba, the Bahamas, the island of Santo Domingo, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and then out here, Puerto Rico and Jamaica, etc. If you're lucky enough to go on a nice cruise of that area in the wintertime, then your heart is being warmed as I speak, just thinking about it. Well, in the 1890s, on the island of Cuba, things were warm, all right. In fact, they were hot, because the Cuban people, who had not managed to free themselves from Spanish rule when most of the rest of Spanish America had broken away back in the early part of the 19th century, were engaged in a revolution against Spain to try to make Cuba into an independent country. For reasons we don't have to discuss today, Spain had held on to Cuba through the 19th century. Important sugar-producing island, making lots of money for Spain, but probably the most significant reason Cuba was hanging on to, or Spain, excuse me, was hanging on to Cuba so tightly was as a point of pride, because the once great American empire of Spain, now gone, except for Cuba and a few little islands, the last vestige of the once great Spanish Empire in America. Well, the Cuban people, many of them, weren't terribly happy about that. And by the middle of the 1890s, pretty nasty, bloody revolution going on in Cuba, trying to get the Spanish to leave. Now, the president of the United States at the time, let me show you a picture of this fellow, was former governor of New York, Grover Cleveland. Now, Cleveland's an interesting fellow for a lot of reasons, but you don't have to worry about him in terms of memorizing anything. But he's former governor of New York, very acceptable, decent president. The only president to serve 2 terms non-consecutively. He'd been elected in the 1880s and then lost in the Electoral College in the election of 1888, and then had come back in the election of 1892. The first bachelor to be married in the White House as president. Interesting guy, and a solid president. Now, you say, why would we care about what's going on in Cuba? Well, immediately the American people began to pay attention to the revolution in Cuba. It was exciting, it was glamorous, lots of stories coming out of Cuba about the heroic rebels, and right away Americans began to identify with the Cuban Revolution because it had only been 100 years since we'd had our own revolution. Pretty soon there was a Cuban George Washington, there was a Cuban Benjamin Franklin, a Cuban Patrick Henry, a Cuban Thomas Jefferson, and the American people began to sympathize deeply with what was going on in Cuba. Now, Cleveland's attitude was, well, that's all very nice, but it's none of our business. Cuba has been in the hands of Spain for 400 years. That's their problem. We're sorry that there are problems there, and indeed American property interests being threatened and so on. But Cleveland's attitude was pretty much, let's keep our hands off of it. Well, in 1896, Cleveland's term ran out, and we had a new presidential election between William Jennings Bryan, whose picture I showed you a minute ago, and the governor of Ohio, this fellow William McKinley. Well, McKinley won the election quite easily. He was seen as the candidate of the status quo of big business, while Bryan seemed a bit of a radical, a bit on the fringe with his ideas about the free coinage of silver and championing the rights of farmers and so on. So McKinley became the president on March 4th, 1897, and immediately began to be bedeviled by this war in Cuba, as increasing numbers of Americans gained an increasing amount of sympathy for the Cuban people. Now remember, there were lots of folks in Cuba who were perfectly happy with Spain's control. Spanish descendants living there who owned a lot of the property and so on. So it had really become kind of a nasty little civil war. The Spanish government, trying to deal with this civil war, this guerrilla war that was going on, began to employ very harsh anti-guerrilla tactics to try to put the Cuban rebellion down. And by the time McKinley became president, Spain was using reconcentration, which means you go in and gather up everybody in a particular area where there's a lot of rebel activity, and you haul them off and put them in big concentration camps, kind of reminiscent of Hitler in World War II, right? And also the suspension of habeas corpus, which requires the police or the army to have evidence against you before they can arrest you. Internment policies, where you can arrest people on mere suspicion. Well, as the Spanish began to employ these harsh anti-guerrilla tactics, and as the American newspapers picked up on this, I mean, look at this photograph that appeared in American newspapers showing what it looked like inside these concentration camps. I mean, again, it looks like the Holocaust from World War II. The American people became increasingly incensed about the presence of Spain in Cuba and began to demand very loudly that President McKinley do something about it. Well, McKinley, like Cleveland, continued to say, look, I'm sorry about what's going on in Cuba. I'm disturbed by it, but this is not our problem. Now, you've got to remember something else as we get into this story. Europe in the 1890s had really just finished ripping off the whole bloody world. They'd had a conference in Berlin in the 1880s in which they carved up Africa like a piece of pie. The French took their piece, the English their piece, the Germans theirs, the Belgians theirs, the Portuguese theirs, and so on. And so the world of the 1890s was a colonial world. And so Cleveland and then McKinley had to tell the American people, look, we can't do anything, even though Cuba's only 90 miles away, we can't do anything to interfere in this because the countries of Europe wouldn't take very kindly if we did. Indeed, the Germans and the British and the French had all visited McKinley and said, look, you keep your hands off Cuba or you're going to have to go to war with us, in addition to Spain. And so McKinley found himself in a bit of a pickle. Well, a year of his presidency went by and it turned over to 1898. Now, if you're the President of the United States, you don't have to worry about being reelected every 4 years. You do have to worry about being reelected every 4 years. But you have to worry about those off-year elections, too, that happen in the middle of your term, because you want to elect congressmen of your own political party so you can get more done. This is called an off-year election. Well, as 1898 rolled around, McKinley and his Republican advisors said to him, look, we've got to do something active about Cuba, or we're going to lose seats in the congressional elections in the fall because the American people are very unhappy that the United States is just standing by while all these terrible things happen over here in Cuba. Well, they sat around and talked about what to do, and finally somebody had a great idea. And the idea was, look, we've got to convince the American people that we're doing something, and we've got to show the world that we're not just going to stand by twiddling our thumbs while all this horrible stuff happens off our coast. Let's send a big battleship, and here's a picture of the very ship, to Havana Harbor in Cuba to let the Spanish know that we mean business, and to tell the Spanish that ship will stay there to protect American interests as long as it needs to be there. The thinking was that sending this ship, the USS Maine, named after the state, would convince Spain that the United States is a big, powerful country. Spain didn't need to be reminded about that. But you better back off on all this trouble that's going on. You better bring some stability and order to the island of Cuba. You're going to have to deal with us. Now, this is a very interesting photograph because what you see here, somebody standing on the shore actually took a picture of the USS Maine in February 1898 steaming into Havana Harbor. This is the famous landmark Morro Castle that the Spanish years before had built to guard the entrance to Havana Harbor. What an amazing photograph. Well, the Maine floated into the middle of the harbor. Let me show you a map of Havana Bay. You can see Morro Castle up there in the upper left-hand corner where the photograph was taken you just looked at. The Maine steamed in, dropped anchor. You see the position right there on the map. Not far away was a Spanish battleship, the Alfonso XII, and not too far away from that, an American liner, ocean liner, passenger ship, the City of Washington. Well, the Maine dropped anchor, and the Spanish protested loudly because you don't send a warship into someone else's harbor without his permission. It's an act of war, but that's all the Spanish could do, was scream and yell. The American people seemed terribly satisfied now that President McKinley had taken some strong action, and so the whole thing seemed to have been a pretty darn good idea, a political success, a public relations success, if you will. Well, there's something called Murphy's Law. I don't know if you've heard of this. It is that if something can go wrong, it will. Well, the Maine hadn't been in Havana Harbor very long until, in the middle of the night, kablooey, the ship blew up. Here's one artist's rendition of what it looked like that terrible night. Here's another one. Terrific explosion. The ship quickly sank, and by morning, this was the scene of the USS Maine lying on the bottom of Havana Harbor with its mast and some of the hull sticking up. Now, what happened? Well, immediately, everybody in the United States who was angry at Spain knew what had happened. The newspapers, for example, printed headlines all over the country, lots of big newspapers, dailies everywhere, looking for good stories, looking for a way to fire up the imagination of people, sell more papers, more advertising, that the Spanish had attacked the Maine with a torpedo or a mine and had sunk this ship and killed 200 or 300 Americans. In fact, it seemed like everybody knew that's what had happened. Well, one newspaper even figured out early on how to use the name of the Maine in a little rhyme. It printed the headline, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." Well, if you're as well versed as I think you are by now in our course, being now something of a historian, having sat through all this, I hope you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, not so fast. How did they know that the Spanish had sunk this ship? Well, the truth is they didn't know. In fact, subsequent studies of the Maine, in 1911, they floated the Maine out into the Atlantic and sunk it out there to get it out of Havana Harbor. They looked it over pretty carefully, took all kinds of pictures, examined it carefully. Then again in the 1970s, under President Jimmy Carter, who was a graduate of the Naval Academy, the United States government went down, took a good long look with diving equipment and all kinds of sophisticated equipment. And then again, in the 1990s, the National Geographic Society, because it's the 100th anniversary, and here's the issue of the magazine, February 1898, spent more than $1 million examining the case again to decide what happened to this ship. Now, we don't know to this very day, when the National Geographic Society had finished its complicated study, here was the conclusion of the article on the last page. The case remains open. In other words, we don't know to this very day who sank the Maine. In fact, we don't even know if anybody sank the Maine or if this was just an accident. There were those who worried, even before the Maine blew up, that the design of these ships, the Maine and a couple of others being built, wasn't very good because the coal bunkers too close to the powder magazine. And so you're just asking for some kind of accident to blow up one of these ships. But again, we don't know to this very day. With sophisticated computer analysis, looking at the plates and which ones blew in and which ones blew out and what could have happened, the case remains open. Now, you've heard me say before in our class, and I'll say it again now, it doesn't really matter what happened in history. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is what people think happened. It doesn't matter if somebody sank the Maine or if it blew up by accident. What matters is that the next day, everybody thought he or she knew what had happened. The Spanish had sunk the ship. Well, contrary to popular belief, and maybe what you heard in your last history class, President McKinley didn't march off to Congress and ask for a declaration of war against Spain because of the sinking of the USS Maine. Instead, a couple of months went by. And McKinley, as you might expect, continued to say, look, we're investigating. We don't know what's going on. He was talking to the British ambassador, the French ambassador, the Germans. He was talking to the Spanish. Oh, we don't know, and back and forth. And a real crisis had set in. Well, the Spanish made a couple of dumb mistakes. Belligerent message intercepted and a few other things. And finally, McKinley, feeling that he had no choice, sent a war message to Congress and asked for the declaration of war against Spain so that the United States could go to Cuba and reestablish order there was the excuse, and to expel the Spanish government from Cuba. Now, shortly after the United States declared war on Spain, in order to keep the other countries in Europe away from the problem, McKinley assured them that the United States had no objective in Cuba other than to restore order and to free Cuba. Everybody backed off except Germany. The Germans, even though they didn't declare war on the U.S., announced that they were going to help the Spanish try to hold on to Cuba, so they sent some guns and some advisors and some money. And the United States went to war with Spain, one-on-one. Now, look, it doesn't take very much to figure out that by 1898, this was not going to be an even contest. Didn't last very long, a few weeks. The United States geared up for war, sent the Marines, sent the Army, sent the Navy. Spain, hard-pressed to defend itself very well, even those folks in Cuba who were on the side of the Spanish, not able to do very much. The Americans linked up with the Cuban rebels, and very quickly, with some fairly tough fighting here and there, the United States defeated Spain and managed to throw the Spanish out of Cuba. Now, it didn't amount to very much. In fact, one historian called it a splendid little war. Wars are never splendid. Here you see some Americans during an assault on a Spanish position, and some of them are getting Spanish bullets in the stomach. A few hundred Americans died in combat. Many more died of disease, bad food, things like that. But again, it didn't take the Americans very long to accomplish their objectives, and Spain left Cuba having lost its last colonial possession of any meaning in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the Cuban story played out as follows. The United States announced that it was establishing a military protectorate over Cuba. And for the next 35 years, the Marines remained behind to make sure things were orderly and stable, to collect the customs, to manage the seaports, things like that. And finally, in 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt withdrew American troops from Cuba and turned the whole thing over to the Cuban people. But unfortunately, the Americans had done very little to prepare the Cubans for self-government, and there followed a couple of pretty nasty dictatorships, including one under the control of a fellow by the name of Batista. And during the 1940s and 50s, this guy exploited Cuba for his own wealth, his own riches. American businessmen, gangsters, gambling interests, and so on. You may have seen this in the movies. Cuba became kind of a stomping ground for the Americans themselves, while the people languished in poverty, the lowest literacy rate in Latin America, and so forth. Well, finally, in the late 1950s, the Cubans had had enough of these dictators and their American friends, and so a fellow called Fidel Castro rose up, threw him out, bellied up to the Russians. And since the late 1950s, Cuba has been a communist country, played very prominently in the Cold War drama of the 1960s and 70s, we'll talk about later. So the American adventure in Cuba didn't turn out very well in terms of how it should have worked out for us and the Cuban people. They didn't wind up with an American-style democracy by any means. They wound up with a communist government. And they certainly have no great debt of gratitude to the United States for having expelled Spain. In fact, Cuba to this day remains an implacable enemy of the United States, and a lot of that's our problem because the politicians don't dare do anything to thaw the relations between the U.S. and Cuba for fear they'll lose the electoral votes of Florida, where lots of Cuban exiles live. But that's a different story. I told you this particular story not because of what happened in Cuba, but because of the things that happened because of the war in Cuba. Very significant events that are going to change every American's life to this very day. When the so-called Spanish-American War began in the late spring and summer of 1898, there was down in the Navy Department an assistant secretary of the Navy, this very interesting chap by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. He'd grown up in New York City, wealthy, silver spoon in his mouth kind of guy. Got involved in New York state politics. In 1896, Roosevelt had supported vigorously the presidency of William McKinley, and so McKinley offered him a job in the administration. Now, Roosevelt had been reading a very popular book at the time written by this fellow you see in this illustration by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. And Mahan had written this book that claimed that the great power of the British nation had been based on its sea power, and that by virtue of that, the British had managed to dominate the world pretty much, and certainly the Atlantic region, ever since the days of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And Mahan argued that the 20th century would be dominated by that country that controlled the Pacific Ocean with its great navy. And Theodore Roosevelt had been reading this book, and he thought, you know what? Mahan's absolutely right. And not only is he absolutely right, but that great nation ought to be the United States. Roosevelt was something of a jingoist. He was something of a chauvinist. If you look that up in the dictionary, it means, hey, ours is better than yours. We're better than everybody else. And so Roosevelt had it in his mind when he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy that the United States should build a great big powerful navy and that it should dominate the Pacific Ocean. And as soon as Roosevelt arrived in Washington to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy, all this talk of war with Spain was growing and growing day by day. And Roosevelt became one of the first people in the administration anxious for the U.S. to go to war with Spain, because in his head, the war with Spain would open up all kinds of opportunities for the United States, build its military power, and to get its hands on overseas bases necessary for a modern navy, because modern battleships fueled by coal needed coaling stations. And you couldn't rely on everybody else to help you out when you need to stop for coal, because who knows who you might be at war with. So Roosevelt had a big view of the Spanish War. He wasn't thinking, this is just to free the Cubans. This is a bigger opportunity for the United States to do a lot more than that. Now, get a load of this story. You're going to find it hard to believe, but check it out if you don't want to believe me. One day, while all this war fever was building, the Secretary of the Navy was out of town. And so Roosevelt did two things. The first thing he did was he sent a cable to the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, then anchored, let me show you another map, in the British colony of Hong Kong, right about there on the coast of China. And this cable said, as soon as you hear that war has broken out between the United States and Spain, you will steam immediately into Manila Bay in the Philippine Islands and there contain the Spanish fleet. Now, let me explain to you what Theodore Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary, has ordered the U.S. Navy to do. Now, the Philippine Islands have been in the control of Spain for as long as Cuba, some 400 years. Has nothing to do with Cuba, but there they are, clear on the other side of the world, under the control of Spain. Now, does he have the authority to order this? Another question. So, what he has done is ordered full war on Spain. not just over Cuba, but war with Spain wherever Spain is, by the use of the American naval power that exists in the region. And this term, there contain the Spanish fleet, is a military euphemism. When you say contain the enemy, that means destroy them. Well, when Commodore Dewey, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, heard that war had been declared against Spain, steamed into Manila Bay in the Philippines, and in a matter of 4 or 5 hours, managed to destroy the Spanish fleet anchored there, killed hundreds of Spanish military personnel. He had a few guys wounded, none seriously enough to be excused from duty. He stormed ashore with the Marines, linked up with a bunch of Filipino rebels. I've got a picture of some of these fellows. In fact, right in the middle of this photograph is a man by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, who had been leading the Filipinos in a rebellion against Spanish authority in the Philippines. And Dewey met with Aguinaldo and he said, look, we're in this to free Cuba from Spain. We'll free the Philippines from Spain as well. Aguinaldo said, good deal. So he helped the Americans, and within a matter of a few weeks, the United States had conquered the Philippine Islands. And Dewey had promised pretty much that the outcome would be the same. The United States would liberate the Philippine Islands from Spain. That would be all there was to it. Now look, I want you to make sure you understand something. By the way, here's a map showing you Dewey's action as he steamed into Manila Bay. Now, keep in mind that the war against Spain was about Cuba. But this fellow Roosevelt didn't see it quite that way. He saw it as a bigger opportunity for bigger things. Let me tell you the other thing Roosevelt did. As soon as he had ordered Dewey to attack the Philippines, he resigned his post at the Navy Department. He went home to New York and organized his own cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders, and with no military experience of any kind, achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel, and here he is in Cuba commanding this bunch of cavalry. In fact, here he is in his fancy uniform that he had made in one of the upscale tailor shops in New York. Not everybody could afford a dandy uniform like this one, but there he is. And so Roosevelt went off to Cuba. Again, we discussed that. The map at the bottom shows you his most famous action. The Rough Riders involved in an assault on the high ground here in southern Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, and Roosevelt and his men, along with some African Americans who got short shift in the press reports. This is the only officer in the Army serving in Cuba who was an African American. But two whole big outfits of African Americans stormed up San Juan Hill. One of them got up there before Roosevelt did. But Roosevelt saw the whole war as an opportunity not only for the United States to become a lot bigger deal than it was, but an opportunity for him to become a lot bigger deal than he was. When he got home from Cuba, and he was heroic, there's no question, he was wounded, he was gallant, he wrote a book called With the Rough Riders in Cuba. One newspaper wag said it should have been called How I Won the War by Theodore Roosevelt. So, like George Armstrong Custer in the Civil War, Roosevelt saw the Spanish-American War as a way for him to become something of a hero, and maybe something even bigger than that. Well, Roosevelt went home to New York and was elected governor of the state of New York. And in 1900, when McKinley was running for re-election, here's a campaign button for McKinley, McKinley asked Roosevelt to run as his vice presidential running mate. And so all of a sudden, here this obscure fellow from New York, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but now a great war hero, governor of New York, became the Vice President of the United States on March 4th, 1901. Well, history rotating on its axis very, very rapidly here. Because just a few months after McKinley and Roosevelt had easily won the election of 1900, McKinley was off in Buffalo, New York for a big international exposition, and some crazy guy walked up to him and shot him. McKinley was not terribly wounded, but he was not cared for very well and became infected and died. And suddenly, Theodore Roosevelt was the President of the United States. So it's like the fellow who had planned this whole thing with his big ideas and his big view from behind the scenes suddenly thrust into the job where he could really make it all happen in a major way. One senator, upon hearing of the death of McKinley, who had lingered for several days and nobody knew for sure if he was going to survive or die, said, "Oh no, that damn cowboy is in the White House." And indeed it was a momentous time as the country's leadership passed from the hands of the mild McKinley into the hands of this rambunctious, grinning, ebullient, chest-thumping, excited cowboy, this Rough Rider, who had almost single-handedly stormed himself into the White House. Well, the 20th century then begins with this fellow running the show. Amazing how the wheels of history had turned so rapidly there at the turn of the 20th century. But wait a minute, there's something else. In fact, it's pretty big. Remember that the effort by the United States when it went to war with Spain was to free Cuba. We didn't do a very good job of that, but we kicked the Spanish out. Well, one day, I'll make this story kind of shorthand for you. One day McKinley had come down to get his war briefing in the summer of '98. And somebody said from the Navy Department, "Mr. President, we've got great news. We've taken the Philippines." Now, think about it. You're the president. You've gone to war to free Cuba from Spain. The Philippine Islands, 10,000 miles away, what's that got to do with anything? Well, it begins to dawn on McKinley how this whole thing had unfolded. But then there was the giant question. What do we do with the Philippines? What do we do with Puerto Rico out there in the Caribbean? What do we do with Guam and other Spanish possessions that the Navy, in the course of war with Spain, have taken away from Spain? That wasn't part of the original deal. So what do we do with these places, and in particular, the Philippines? Presented McKinley with quite a problem. Now, his advisors were pulling him all kinds of different directions. Let me refer you back to our 3 words that we began to discuss at the outset of this unit. There were those who said, look, we've been moving west ever since we got off the boat at Jamestown. To take colonies in the Pacific all the way to the western edge of the Pacific in the Philippines is just a natural part of American history. Expansion and that theme in American history fit right into these folks arguing. One guy joked, we should go right on around and retake New York. And then there were those advising McKinley who said, look, all the great nations of the world have their own colonies. They produce manufactured goods, industrial production. They obtain raw materials from their colonies. They add value to those and they sell them back to the colonies and everybody's happy. So those businessmen were urging McKinley to take a wider view and that the United States should now, as an outcome of the Spanish War, keep these Spanish possessions, other than Cuba, because we'd said we wouldn't, and for the United States to become a major imperial power. Now, I hope you're sensing the irony here. We had begun the war against Spain to free Cuba from Spain because we were the great defender of self-determination and But very shortly now, because of the taking of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and these other Spanish possessions, there are those arguing that the United States should make a complete 180-degree turn and become a major colonial power itself. In other words, we should join the great family of nations out there, the British, the French, and everybody else, and have our own colonies. And indeed, if we want to be a great nation in the 20th century, we really have no choice but then to play the game the way everybody else is playing it. And if we're going to have a big, strong Navy out in the Pacific, we're going to have coaling stations and bases. We should stop this nonsense and just go ahead and play the game like every other great power plays the game. Well, one force in American life that might have tried to prevent this was this notion that we're better than that. We're the great reformers. We're the ones who say things like all men are created equal and have a right to life and liberty, and that government should be by the consent of the governed. Should we now become, like everybody else, just another colonial power? Well, President McKinley listened to all of this pressure, and one day he had said to his circle, his advisors, look, I don't know what to do. I'm going to take this question to the Almighty. McKinley, very religious chap, announced in advance that he was going to take the matter of what the United States should do with the Philippines and these other Spanish possessions we had taken to God himself for an answer. Now you might say, well, if McKinley's really going to listen to God, God's going to say, don't do this, it's wrong. Well, don't be so sure. Because McKinley came out of his bedchamber one morning, called his staff together and his advisors, and he said, gentlemen, I have had a marvelous experience. That's a quote. Everybody agreed to that. Some later said that McKinley said he'd had a vision. Most of them said, no, he didn't say anything like that. Others said, well, he heard a voice. What they all agreed on was that McKinley suddenly, having presented this problem to the Almighty, had come to know the mind of God and the will of God with regard to the future of the United States. Can remember, this is the middle of 1898. We're a couple of years out from the first months and years of the 20th century. And President William McKinley announced that the United States was going to keep the Philippine Islands as a colony. It was going to keep Puerto Rico. It was going to annex Hawaii. Happened in 1898. It was going to keep Guam and Midway and various other Spanish possessions, and would become a colonial power, just like the other great nations. What an about-face for the United States since the Revolution, huh? Well, what's interesting here, in addition to the change that will now come upon the U.S. because it has changed its position on colonialism, is that when McKinley justified the United States becoming an imperial power, he did not emphasize that it was part of our tradition for expansion. He did not emphasize economic motivations because our great industries would benefit supposedly from holding colonies. What McKinley emphasized was the reform impulse. In fact, in speech after speech after speech, McKinley said, the reason the United States is now going to become a colonial power and have its own colonies worldwide, a far-flung empire, is not because of any selfish motivation and not because of any historic tendency of the American people to expand, but because the United States is a great nation, and it is now our responsibility as the American people to spread that greatness to everyone else. And indeed, McKinley announced that the United States was now going to embark on a new course of what had always been known as the American mission. And McKinley said, it is our responsibility, because much has been given to us, we're a very blessed country, to spread those blessings now to others, beginning with our colonies. Now, I hate to mention this because it's not very pleasant, but racism played a major role in this. I mean, for example, get a load of this. In one of his speeches, McKinley said, "We're going to teach our little brown brothers in the Philippines to be good Christians and to govern themselves under the ideals of democratic capitalism." Our little brown brothers. So there was this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, and that the United States was now going to be that great power that went out into the world and helped the rest of the world to be like us. I don't know, to sing in perfect harmony and drink Coke, I guess. To spread the benefits of Christianity and the democratic capitalist system that had blessed the United States so greatly up through to the end of the 19th century. Now, there was living in the United States at this time a very talented British author, poet by the name of Rudyard Kipling. You probably know Kipling from things like The Jungle Book, Rikki Tikki Tavi, The Man Who Would Be King. Amazing author. He had grown up in British colonial India. And so Kipling had quite an interesting perspective on this whole business of colonial power. And he wrote this poem in 1898 called The White Man's Burden. And essentially in the poem, Kipling said, well, you Americans can call it the American mission, you can call it whatever you want, but really what you're doing is you're just following what we've been doing. Pick up the white man's burden, which is to bless the rest of the world with all the benefits of white civilization. The Christian faith, democratic political ideals, free market capitalism, and raise up the rest of the world. But Kipling said, you're about to assume this burden, but be aware it is a burden. The British have been packing it around for a couple of hundred years. Now it's your turn, said Kipling. And so at the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had changed course dramatically. And under President William McKinley, and then under his rambunctious vice president, now president after the assassination of McKinley in September 1901, the United States would pick up this burden and would spend the 20th century and beyond carrying the American mission to the world, which was and is to help the world to govern itself better, to have higher ideals, to be better economically, indeed, to be more like us. Well, the epilogue to the story is that the Filipinos weren't terribly happy to find out that the United States intended to keep the Philippines as a colony. So the Filipinos who had been fighting the Spanish just started fighting us. And under President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, the United States ruthlessly crushed the Philippine insurrection. And the United States settled in to the Philippines as the colonial master of a far-flung nation clear across the ocean, because we saw it as our duty, as our mission, to make them a better place and to make them a better people. Now, look, I all think you can see the significance of this little story we've just discussed to open Unit 7. The United States has been carrying the white man's burden ever since. We spent years after World War II with a nuclear target painted on our backs because the United States was going to stand up to the threat of international communism. We've sent our men and women to die in places like Iraq and Afghanistan by virtue of this sense that it is our mission to teach the world to be more like us. It's very expensive, very difficult. When Kipling said it was a burden, he wasn't kidding. What a burden it has been.